After serving out his extremely popular term as consul, Julius Caesar was given 4 legions and the job of governing several peaceful northern Roman provinces, notably southern Gaul, which is now southern France. Caesar was itching for an excuse, any excuse, to start conquering and looting. So he was delighted when the Celtic Helvetians asked permission to migrate across the Roman Proctorate in Gaul in 58 BC. Caesar refused the request. The Helvetians went ahead anyway, and Caesar jumped in front of them with 6 legions. He built a long wall across their path near Lake Geneva and waited. The Helvetians waited too. When the Helvetians tried to maneuver around Caesar, he caught them crossing a river and smashed their rear. Then he pursued them closely, allowing them no rest and killing any stragglers, until he accidentally outreached his supply lines. As he pulled back, the Helvetians turned around and pursued him, until the Romans made a stand on a hill in the town of Bibecrate in central France. They repulsed the Helvetian attacks, counterattacked, and then destroyed them. According to documents that Caesar found in the abandoned Helvetian camp, 368,000 Helvetians had set out, but now only 110,000 were left. He resettled the survivors back in their old home, now Switzerland, to prevent the Germans from expanding into the empty land, but it was already too late for that. 2 tribes, the Aedui and the Sequani, were having a war. So the Sequani hired the Suabwe, a German tribe under Ariovistus, to come help. The Aedui were beaten, but Ariovistus wouldn't leave the Sequani lands. He seized a third of the territory, where he settled 120,000 of his own people. Then, Ariovistus increased his claim to 2/3 of the Sequani territory. Caesar, however, was not going to let the Germans assemble a powerful new territory so close to the Roman frontier. So, in response to pleas from the Aedui, he demanded the Suabwe withdraw. When Ariovistus refused, Caesar took 30,000 men north in September. The Romans surrounded the camp at Vosges and calmly forced their lines in and attacked. After a 15-mile pursuit and losing 25,000 men, the Suabwe escaped back across the Rhine. For the next year, Caesar stayed in the north battling the Belgae, a big group of Gallic tribes that was arming itself against Roman expansion. In June 56 BC, Caesar built a wooden bridge over the Rhine in 10 days. The first to ever span the river. This awe-inspiring feat of engineering intimidated most of the local tribes into giving him hostages as a token of their surrender. Caesar had to spend only 18 days across the river, burning the town of the one tribe that resisted him. He destroyed the bridge upon retreat rather than leave it as an unguarded backdoor into the empire. Caesar crossed over to Britain in 55 BC to see whether it was worth conquering. The British proved much more formidable than he had expected. He ran dangerously low on supplies, but raided out from his beachhead and destroyed some villages to show he wasn't going to be bullied into a retreat. But he eventually retreated to the mainland. In the winter of 54 to 53 BC, King Ambiorix of the Germanic Eburones tricked the local Roman forces into accepting safe passage across his territory. But then he ambushed them. Most of a Roman legion was wiped out. The survivors fled back to their camp and committed suicide rather than become prisoners of the Germans. Caesar arrived and retaliated by destroying every village and farm in the territory of the Eburones. Although most of the people fled and hid from direct Roman vengeance, they now starved in the winter. Caesar also gave the neighboring tribes permission to do whatever they wanted to the Eburones. Although we don't know exactly what these tribes did, we do know they were treated like the kids who wore tails to school. By 53 BC, Caesar had 10 legions and swept through Gaul again, making sure all of the tribes knew he was in charge. He crushed a string of stubborn Gallic tribes one by one, selling women and children to the slavers who followed his army everywhere he went. Plutarch reports that 1 million Gauls were taken captive during Caesar's campaigns. The flood of cheap slaves into Italy eventually impoverished the Roman working class, which furthered and undermined the democratic functions of an already decadent Roman republic. With the campaign complete, Caesar was able to declare the whole region to be Roman territory. The Gauls decided to take one last shot at driving away the invaders. A large coalition of previously pacified tribes rose in revolt under Vercingetorix, chieftain of the Arverni tribe. Then, the Romans sieged the capital at Aversium. Through 27 days of heavy rain, the Romans tried to assemble wheeled siege towers to take the town, while Gallic raiders tried to disrupt their building. Finally, the siege engines were ready, and the Roman assault overran the walls. The conquerors killed everyone inside. Caesar reported no survivors, neither old men, nor women, nor children. Of the whole population, which was about 40,000, only 800 who rushed out of the town at the first alarm got safely through Vercingetorix. Vercingetorix had remained at large during the siege at Aversium, winning several small battles before Caesar cornered him in the stronghold at Alesia. Vercingetorix gave up. He threw himself on Caesar's mercy. Although Caesar had a reputation for forgiving his enemies, this time, Caesar held firm. Vercingetorix was stashed in a jail for a few years until the festive day of Caesar's triumphal procession, when he was dragged out, paraded through the streets of Rome, and ritually strangled at the end. And after one more Roman civil war, Caesar finally became dictator of Rome. As the leading edge of Western civilization shifted to Northern Europe, Italy fell behind most modern trends. Italy didn't even become a unified country until the mid-19th century, and it almost missed getting a slice when the Europeans carved up Africa. As a latecomer, Italy was only given a few coastal stretches of desert that no one wanted. When the Italians tried to enlarge their holdings by conquering Ethiopia in 1896, their army was badly beaten, making Ethiopia the only native state in Africa to survive European ambition, also making the Italians the laughingstock of imperialists everywhere. When Benito Mussolini took power in Italy, he tried again, bringing industrial firepower to the situation. In 1935, two columns invaded into Ethiopia from the Italian colonies on either side, Somaliland in the south and Eritrea in the east. Italian aircraft bombed and strafed Ethiopian troops, villages, and cities. Ethiopian soldiers were mowed down by machine guns and choked with mustard gas. Although it wasn't quite the naked spearmen charging tanks, they did have a few guns and swords, but regardless, the Ethiopian army was completely outclassed and overwhelmed, losing almost 20 of their own soldiers for every Italian they killed. Because blatant imperialism had grown unfashionable since the 19th century, the world condemned Mussolini. The Ethiopian emperor delivered an impassioned plea in Geneva to the League of Nations to rescue his ancient land. So the League imposed economic sanctions against Italy, one of the first times this tactic was ever used. It became an early example of sanctions failing miserably. Many statesmen and strategists suggesting that extending the embargo to oil or closing the Suez Canal to Italian shipping would be better, but these were dismissed as impractical or needlessly provocative. No one really wanted to make the Italians angry. In May 1936, the Italians took the capital, Addis Ababa, and Ethiopia stayed quiet for a short time while the remnants of the native armies organized an underground resistance. In February 1937, they tried to kill Italian General Rodolfo Graziani, and the Italians launched a 3-day retaliatory massacre in Addis Ababa in which thousands of citizens were killed. In May, the Italians destroyed the Shawan monastery of Dabra Libianos and executed several hundred resident monks. The guerrilla war continued, as did the Italian retaliation. Finally, World War II brought Ethiopia into the larger fight between Italy and Britain, which made the Italian colonies fair game for an Allied offensive. The British flew Haile Selassie into Sudan to wait while the British troops cleared the Italians out of East Africa in 1941. When all was safe, he was allowed to reclaim his throne. Procopius, the official historian in the court of Emperor Justinian, kept 2 sets of books. By day, he wrote public histories that showered praise on the emperor, but at night, he would pull out his secret history and describe what really happened. Much of what we think we know about this era depends on whether you consider Procopius a liar. Justinian was born in 483 to a peasant family somewhere in the Balkans. Justinian would have passed unknown to history if his uncle Justin hadn't joined the palace guard in Constantinople and worked his way up through the ranks to become commander. From there, Uncle Justin easily made himself emperor in 518, when the old emperor died childless. Having no children himself, Justin adopted his nephew Justinian as his chief assistant and heir. As Justin became senile, Justinian became the true ruler of the empire long before he officially inherited the throne at the age of 44. Empress Theodora, Justinian's wife, was known for her promiscuity. She also became famous for her talents in acting and comedy, and how good she was at sexy roles in plays. Also, she was the daughter of a circus bear keeper, among other things. Justinian considered her a valuable partner, and all imperial edicts were issued in both their names. Theodora set a standard of easy sexual licentiousness among the ruling class, since I guess she convinced them to kick out the Thought Patrol. She was also known for her backbone and wasn't pushed around easily. Thanks to Procopius, we have a vivid record of it all. Justinian maintained an aggressive foreign policy designed to turn back the clock to the glory days of the Roman Empire. And that's where he racked up his highest body counts. Justinian has a reputation among historians for picking extremely talented assistants from seemingly out of the blue. Early in his reign, he began to favor a junior officer on the Persian front, Belisarius, with promotions over more experienced officers. Belisarius never let him down. He launched an armada against the Vandal Kingdom in North Africa, with 15,000 ground forces, 32,000 sailors, his wife Antonina as his right-hand administrator, and the historian Procopius as his spy master. The Romans landed on the desert coast, far from the center of Vandal power, but Belisarius quickly rolled over all resistance and took Carthage. He crossed the first enemy kingdom off his list and returned home to bask in the appreciation of Justinian. Within a year, Belisarius was back in the west to put down a mutiny of the troops he had left in charge of Africa. Then, he turned toward the Gothic kingdom of Italy, and systematically worked his way northward. The Pope threw open the gates of Rome to Belisarius, but in December of 536, the Goths arrived and besieged the Roman force inside. The Roman position inside the city deteriorated as supplies dwindled, but so did the condition of the attacking Goths. The siege could have gone either way, until Antonina and Procopius recruited fresh troops in Naples and hurried north to reinforce Belisarius. In February, Gothic King Witticus called a time out to negotiate a compromise, but Belisarius stalled and used the 3 months armistice to move troops within striking distance of the Gothic capital at Ravenna. Justinian started to worry that Belisarius was getting too powerful, so he sent another army from Constantinople under the eunuch Narses to coordinate with Belisarius. Although Narses had no military experience, he proved surprisingly adept. Unfortunately, having 2 headstrong generals in joint command of the same army confused their subordinates. When a Gothic counterattack besieged the Roman city of Milan and brought it to the brink of starvation, the nearby Roman relief force wouldn't budge until orders arrived from both Belisarius and Narses. By then, it was too late. King Witticus had offered safe passage to the Roman general inside Milan if he surrendered, but this offer did not extend to the city's civilians, whom Witticus planned to punish for betraying him. The Roman general tried to reject the offer, but his soldiers were hungry and forced him to accept. As the Roman garrison abandoned Milan, the Goths moved in and destroyed the city, slaughtering 300,000 men and selling off the women. Italy was so devastated that it needed time to recover before anyone would consider it worth fighting over again. Everyone with weapons came to an agreement about who got control of what, and they all took quick naps. In the year 541, Totila, Gothic king of Italy, resumed the war and scored a 3-year winning streak. So Justinian sent Belisarius back to Italy for a second round. As the armies attacked back and forth, the city of Rome switched hands several times, until finally, in 548, Belisarius got caught on the wrong side of palace politics in Constantinople and was pushed into retirement. So Narses arrived to take over the war in 552. He killed Totila in battle and retook Rome. The next king of the Goths was also defeated and killed the next year. Taking advantage of the chaos, the Franks and the Alemanni invaded Italy from the north in August of 553. Narses defeated them as well and settled the remnant of the invaded horde in Italy. Finally, with the Romans in control of the situation, the war came to an end. Procopius claimed that Justinian killed 1 trillion people. I think it's fair to say that's a bit exaggerated. Historian Edward Gibbons said that he thinks Justinian killed 100 million people, and many people just ran with that number. But considering that the population in that area was estimated to be 26 million, that's also not true. And much of the authenticated population decline under Justinian came from bubonic plague, which wiped out around 1/4 of the population. There were also constant raids from the Balkans, which killed many people in the empire, so we can't blame the guy for every death in the area. But every historian, even the ones who are cautious about throwing numbers around, agreed that Italy was devastated by the Reconquest. For the sake of ranking, I'm blaming Justinian's Western Wars for 750,000 deaths. This comes to 15% of the 5 million population who probably lived in Italy and Tunisia. It's just a guess though. Just like the rest of the death toll estimates, even the best documented ones have large discrepancies when it comes to death counts. Most, if not all, the numbers in this series are just shots in the dark. By now, almost all of the coastal regions of the Western Mediterranean had fallen under the domination of either Carthage or Rome. These competing empires were divided by the Ebro River in Spain, until the city of Saguntum and the Carthaginian sphere switched sides and asked the Romans for protection. Hannibal, the Carthaginian general on the spot, would allow none of that. So he stormed and sacked Saguntum. Before the Romans could do much more than complain and issue their formal declaration of war, Hannibal marched a Carthaginian army from Spain, up the coast, and over the Alps into Italy. Over the next few years, a series of Roman armies tried to stop Hannibal, but each was defeated. Well, no, more than just defeated, annihilated. Eventually, Hannibal stood to meet the Romans in full force in southern Italy with an army only a little more than half the size of the Romans. After getting the Roman troops right where he wanted, Hannibal systematically destroyed them in what many would consider a perfect victory. In 2 years, the Romans had lost 150,000 men to Hannibal. Roman allies began to defect after this. Siacrus, which was defending itself against the Romans as much as Carthage was, used weapons that seemed almost magical. Weapons that were designed by mathematician Archimedes. Things like a mechanical claw that grabbed ships and dashed them against the rocks, and a mirror that focused the sun's rays into a deadly heat beam. There is some doubt whether they were real or not, but it's more fun to imagine that they were. Eventually, however, Roman discipline and martial skill defeated their ingenuity. Siacrus was taken, and Archimedes was killed during the sacking of the city. Unable to defeat the Carthaginians in Italy, the Romans sent an army under Scipio to take Spain away from them. After a protracted war that cut Carthage off from this vital source of wealth and manpower, Hasdrubal, the Carthaginian commander in Spain, broke contact and followed his brother Hannibal's path into Italy. Along the way, 2 Roman armies converged on his army and cornered it on a rocky, uneven ground at the Metatarus River in Italy, where he found it difficult to deploy his battle lines. The Roman armies wiped out Hasdrubal before he could add his army to Hannibal's, and a Roman rider flung his severed head into his brother's camp. Eventually, Scipio's Romans landed in North Africa, which forced Hannibal to abandon Italy and hurry back to defend his homeland. Scipio convinced the Numidian neighbors of Carthage, suppliers of prime cavalry, to switch to the Roman side. And then he destroyed the last Carthaginian army at Zama when Hannibal's war elephants panicked and stampeded back into Carthaginian lines. The ensuing peace treaty put the entire western Mediterranean under Roman control. France already had a standing quarrel with Algiers because of the Barbary pirates they spawned. The pirates raided merchant ships and sold anyone they captured to the Middle Eastern slave trade. It's estimated that over 1 million Europeans and 4 to 10 million Africans went through the slave market. We'll talk more about the Middle Eastern slave trade later on the list. In 1827, while negotiating payment for a debt the French owed some North African merchants from the Napoleonic Wars, Hussein, the ruler of Algiers, gave a good smack to the French council with a fly whisk. Back in Paris, King Charles X of France was widely disliked, but he decided that avenging this insult to French dignity and ending the Barbary pirates' slave trade would boost his popularity. So he sent French warships to blockade Algiers. When the Algerians fired on one of the French ships, the French retaliated by occupying all of the cities on the Algerian coast. Critics inside and outside France denounced the conquest as pure aggressive adventurism. Even conquering Algeria failed to make King Charles popular, and in 1830, the French people threw him out and put a new king on the throne. The new king, Louis Philippe, was hoping to get out of North Africa, but his throne was too shaky to risk alienating imperialists in France by abandoning the war, so he reluctantly continued to escalate the fight against the native Arab opposition. In 1831, faced with a shortage of citizens willing to fight in the war, France created a special army, the French Foreign Legion. The Legion was stocked with the toughest, meanest, cutthroats, and scoundrels recruited from all over the world, lured in with promises of sanctuary, citizenship, regular pay, and adventure. For several years, the French couldn't decide whether they wanted to keep Algeria, so they didn't spread beyond the few coastal towns they occupied. Finally, in 1834, they officially accepted Algeria as their colony and began to organize an administration for it. By this time, tribal elders had selected Abd al-Qadir, the 25-year-old son of a prominent holy man, to rule the unconquered interior region of Algeria from a new capital at Tlemcen. As the resistance solidified, the Algerians harassed the foreign French forces with raids and ambushes. The French, unaccustomed to this kind of war, were easy targets. The inland city of Constantine withstood several years of French attacks. Perched on a rocky plateau, Constantine was difficult to reach, and the first French offensive in 1836 was easily driven off. The Arabs hounded the retreating French with sniper fire and night attacks that whittled them down to a fraction of their original size. In 1837, the French finally took Constantine after bombardment, house-to-house street fighting, and angry massacres, all of which left 20,000 Arab civilians dead in the streets. By May 1841, the number of French troops deployed in Algeria reached 60,000, but equipment and tactics had been designed to blow away large armies in the fields of Europe, so they made no headway against the mobile skirmishing used by local Arabs and Berbers. Then, the new French commander, appointed in 1841, Marshal Thomas Robert Buegued, overhauled the entire operation. He lightened the soldiers' packs, started to carry baggage on mules, left behind heavy artillery, redesigned marching formation, and removed hired Arabs from the French army to avoid confusion on who the enemy was. In June 1845, a rebel tribe took refuge with their families in a cave at Dara and refused to surrender. French Colonel Aimable Pelissier ordered a bonfire set at the mouth of the cave that consumed all of the oxygen in the cave and replaced it with carbon monoxide. Pelissier's official report to Paris proudly described the incident as a fine example of clever tactics, but he was shocked when French public opinion erupted in protest at his brutality. His colleague, Colonel Armand Jacques Saint-Arnaud, learned the lesson, so when he sealed up another 500 natives who took refuge in another cave in August, he kept it a secret. He lied to his men and his superiors, telling them that these caves were empty and were being blown up only as a precaution. It took several tries before the fighting in Algeria ended. In 1836, Abd el-Qadar looked beaten, so he agreed to a peace treaty splitting Algeria between direct and indirect French rule. But in 1839, the French encroached on the region of indirect rule, and the war started up again. The French chased Abd el-Qadar into Morocco in 1843. Although Abd el-Qadar kept up border raids from his base in Morocco, he finally surrendered in December of 1847. The French allowed him to peacefully retire to Lebanon. Most Europeans dumped their African colonies between 1955 and 1965, after which the last white rule in Africa was a block of lands in the south. The apartheid regimes of South Africa and Rhodesia nestled among the Portuguese colonies of Angola and Mozambique. A large group of rebels inside Portuguese East Africa organized the Front for Liberation of Mozambique, also called Frelimo, in 1962. They kept the pressure on the Portuguese government with a backwoods civil war for the next dozen years and the hopes that the imperialists would eventually give up and go home. In 1974, a coup in Lisbon replaced the military dictatorship of Portugal, and the next year, the new government granted independence to Portugal's overseas colonies. Frelimo took control of Mozambique, after which the government declared itself communist and cultivated support from the Soviets. Mozambique now became a haven and staging center for rebels fighting against the neighboring apartheid regimes. In retaliation, Rhodesia and South Africa organized and armed anyone they could for the new rebel organization. The Mozambique resistance movements, called Renamo, had no unifying ideology or political goals other than the overthrow of Frelimo. Renamo's leadership came from older authorities down on their luck. Petty chiefs, healers, witch doctors, spirit mediums, since they lost their positions of power as Frelimo laid the foundations for a pan-ethnic socialist millennium. Magic played a useful part in keeping up Renamo's fighting spirit. If its fighters rubbed their bodies with herbs, Frelimo's bullets would turn into water. Support to Renamo came from the peasants who were forced by Frelimo to give up whatever small land they had and forced to work on collective farms instead, which is where a sizable amount of the deaths came from. As we'll find out later on the list, communist collective farms do not work very well. People go hung-hung. Renamo tried to destabilize the government by terrorizing civilians and damaging the economy. The rebels destroyed bridges and power plants, bringing the country to its knees. Even worse, their attacks against the general population were designed to maximize terror. Villagers often had their ears, lips, and noses cut off, and then they were let loose as a warning to others. In 1988, a report for the US State Department estimated that Renamo had blatantly murdered 100,000 people during the mid-1980s with raids, kidnappings, and random shootings. Their atrocities drove 1 million refugees into exile in other countries, and left another 3.5 million displaced internally. After years of war, the World Bank ranked Mozambique as the poorest country in the world. Talks between the two sides began in 1990, and soon after that, Frelimo's main sponsor, the USSR, collapsed, and aid from South Africa to the Renamos disappeared too. This left Mozambique entirely on its own, no longer a pawn in larger struggles. Without sponsors to supply fresh ammunition, the two sides agreed to a ceasefire in 1992. In 1994, Mozambique decided to hold elections. It was between Frelimo, whose farm collectivization killed hundreds of thousands of people, and Renamo, who blatantly killed 100,000 people and indirectly killed many more. And America thinks its electoral candidates are bad. The great Khan Manke, one of like 10,000 grandsons of Chinggis Khan, was annoyed that the Muslim minority scattered around his empire considered the Caliph in Baghdad, the secular ruler of Iraq and spiritual leader of all Sunni Muslims, to be more important than the great Khan himself. This was not to be tolerated. The Caliph had to go bye-bye. Rumors of invasion preparations soon came to the ears of the Order of the Assassins, a mysterious Muslim cult in the mountain fortress of Alamnat in Persia, who trained specialized killers to strike down enemies all over the world. Although the assassins were no friends of the Caliph, when it became obvious that the Mongols were getting ready to invade westward, the assassins dispatched 400 of their best to assassinate Monkey. Well, the plan failed, and in 1253, Monkey ordered his brother Hulagu to retaliate. In 1256, after a few years of preparation and hard riding, the Mongols arrived, but a new Grand Master was in charge of the assassins, and he quickly surrendered to avoid the worst. He accompanied the Mongols on a circuit of the assassins' castles, ordering them to surrender, which brought an end to the order. The Grand Master was initially treated well for his cooperation, but eventually his Mongol attendants found an excuse to kick and beat him to death. The next year, Hulagu sent messengers to Baghdad insisting that the Caliph tear down the city walls, fill the moat, and come groveling to Hulagu to offer his subservience. The Caliph was in the middle of a power struggle among some of his officials and couldn't find the time to respond, so Hulagu advanced. The Mongols arrived at Baghdad in January of 1258, and within a week, it was obvious that further resistance was pointless. The Caliph and his generals surrendered, and Hulagu ordered the city destroyed. Although Hulagu himself followed the traditional tribal shamanism of the Mongols, his mother, favorite wife, and chief general were all Nestorian Christians from Central Asia, and they convinced Hulagu to spare the Christian population. They were told to take refuge in their church, which was then declared off-limits during the subsequent sack. The rest of the city's population was killed. Books from the Great Library were dumped in the Tigris River, which ran black with ink and red with blood. Because the Mongols believed it was bad luck to spill royal blood on the earth, they rolled the Caliph in a carpet and trampled him to death with horses. This extinguished the line of caliphs that stretched all the way back to Muhammad. Persian historians later claimed that 800,000 to 2 million people died in the sacking of Baghdad. But in diplomatic correspondence with King Louis IX of France, Hulagu himself reported that he had killed 200,000. The Mongols then swept through Syria, accepting the surrender of the Arab cities of Damascus and Aleppo, and the Crusader state of Antioch. The Mongol tide was about to stink up Egypt when word arrived that the great Khan Möngke had died. Hulagu returned to Mongolia to settle the succession, leaving behind a subordinate to continue the conquest. Egyptian Mamelukes sadly beat these Mongols and killed their general at the Battle of Spring Goliath in Palestine, the farthest the Mongols would ever reach in this part of the world. An alien dynasty of Shan, which were mountain people from the border between Siam and Burma, had run Burma for many generations, until the native Toungoo dynasty threw them out. The first two Toungoo kings consolidated control over Burma and set up a new capital at Pegu. The third Toungoo ruler, I'm gonna butcher this, King Bayan, spent his first year suppressing rebellions in the kingdom he inherited. Once that was settled, he attacked north and conquered all of the Shan states inland from the Burmese heartland. He systematically attacked in every direction, eventually establishing an empire that reached across inland Southeast Asia. In 1567, Bayanong sent his army, which was said to number 1.5 million, to take Ayutthaya, capital of Siam. The siege took 2 years and cost him around 500,000 soldiers. In the end, he reduced Siam to a vassal state and installed an allied Thai king, Phra Maha Thamaraja, from the independent upriver city of Phitsanulok on the throne of Ayutthaya. But he took the king's children back with him to Pegu as hostages in 1569. Bayan Nuang stiffened his army with Portuguese mercenaries, who had trouble pronouncing his name and called him Braginoko. He is renowned as the most glorious empire builder in Burmese history, but the Burmese didn't get much of a chance to enjoy being masters of Southeast Asia because as soon as Bayanong died in 1581, Siam got their most glorious empire builder right next door. The Black Prince, Narwiswan, son of the king of Siam, spent his youth as a hostage in Pegu to be executed if his father got out of line. Legend says he became the best friend of Bayanong's principal grandson, a boy his own age named Minchi Tswa. However, after many years of rivalry and various contests of strength, skill, and endurance, they had a final falling out when Narwiswan's game bird beat Minchi Tswa in a prestigious cockfight. At the age of 16, Narwiswan returned to Ayutthaya to rule as vassal of Bayanwang. Then, in 1583, 2 years after the death of Bayanwang, he declared himself sovereign and drove out the Burmese garrison. The Burmese army returned in full force under the crown prince, his childhood friend, Minchi Tswa. Legend has the two of them fighting a climactic duel on war elephants. After the elephants killed each other, the two princes stood face to face with swords. The fight continued until Narwiswan split Minchi Tswa in half from shoulder to waist. With their prince killed, the Burmese army broke and ran, leaving 200,000 men dead on the field. Narwiswan's older sister, I'm not even going to try to say that, had remained in Pegu as a hostage and member of the royal harem. When news of Prince Minchi Tswa's death arrived, his grief-stricken and angry father, King Nanda Bayan of Burma, had her brought to him and killed, even though she was pregnant with the king's child. Narwiswan invaded Burma several times during his reign, devastating the countryside and spreading famine. During his siege of Pegu in 1596, starvation drove the defenders to cannibalism, and King Nanda Bayan ordered all Siamese residents of the city butchered to feed the Burmese. Even as Pegu's population plunged from 150,000 to 30,000, Narwiswan camped outside with dwindling supplies and lost 100,000 of his own soldiers to hunger. Eventually, he had to retreat before the city fell. A Jesuit visiting Burma reported seeing the ruins of gilded temples and stately edifices, lying along the banks of rivers, the roads and fields full of skulls and bones, killed or famished, and their bodies thrown into the streams in such multitudes as to hinder the passage of vessels. As Burma deteriorated and descended into civil war, Pegu was abandoned as the capital. Meanwhile, Narwiswan secured independence for the Shan as a buffer state against potential Burmese aggression. He and his brother had befriended the Shan prince of that place, when all three of them were hostages in the Burmese court. The Siamese brothers were leading 2 columns of troops totaling 200,000 against the Burmese and Shan territory when Narwiswan died. Many centuries ago, tall, Neolithic cattle herders from Sudan went south. About the same time, stocky Bantu farmers from the western hump of Africa were migrating eastward. They crashed and mingled in the lake region, and after many unrecorded struggles, the Neolithic Tutsi aristocracy ended up ruling over the Bantu Hutu peasantry. That was the situation that the first European explorers discovered in the middle of the 19th century. In the scramble for Africa, the region was split between the Germans and the Belgians. After the First World War, the overseas German colonies were quickly divvied up among the winners. 2 inland pieces of German East Africa, adjacent to the Belgian Congo, were handed over to the Belgians as a League of Nations mandate, which, by the terms of the treaty, had to be administered separately from the rest of the Belgian colonies. Both the Germans and the Belgians relied on local Tutsi nobility to help them rule, and in exchange, granted them privileges that were denied to the Hutu, such as an exemption from the 60 days of free labor that all natives owed the state. Because centuries of interbreeding and coexistence had worn away the physical and cultural differences between the two groups, the Belgians issued identification cards that clearly labeled each person as one or the other, so the authorities would know who was entitled to preferential treatment. Those of mixed or uncertain ancestry were arbitrarily assigned their ethnicity based on the whim of the colonial officials. Hutu and Tutsi usually identified one another by subtle class differences, rather than anything immediately obvious to outsiders. Both groups spoke the same language and were mostly Catholic by the time of independence. In 1962, the League of Nations mandates turned the colony into the independent countries of Burundi and Rwanda. Unfortunately, this land split in ethnicity created an inherently unstable situation. Chronic suspicion between Hutu and Tutsi led to civil wars and mindless killings. For a time, the worst such massacre in memory occurred in 1972, when a ruling Tutsi regime in Burundi slaughtered some 100,000 to 150,000 Hutu, and sent thousands of Hutu refugees over the border into Hutu-dominated Rwanda. A later generation would see even worse. On April 6, 1994, the Hutu presidents of Burundi and Rwanda were flying back from negotiating a peace treaty with a group of Tutsi rebels when their plane was shot down by surface-to-air missiles. No one knows for sure who did it, but Hutu leaders blamed Tutsi rebels and immediately started killing. But others claim that Hutu extremists manufactured an excuse to crack down on the Tutsi by assassinating a couple of presidents who they thought sold them out. Regardless, by the next day, infuriated Hutu militias, the Interahamwe, which means those who work together, began to massacre Tutsi all across Rwanda. The genocide was masterminded by Defense Minister Theoneste Bagosora, and he was terribly efficient. Within 2 weeks, before the international community even had a chance to flinch, 250,000 men, women, and children had been hacked apart, often with the genocide's characteristic weapon, the machete. Among the first to die was Prime Minister Agathe, not even gonna try to say that last name, and she was killed with bayonets. She was guarded by Belgian soldiers from the UN, and they were under orders not to provoke the locals by fighting back. So they surrendered without a fight, only to be castrated and gagged with their own nuts, and killed anyway. All across the country, in attacks coordinated and encouraged by radio propagandists, Hutu turned against their Tutsi neighbors. Teachers killed their students, Hutu babysitters killed their Tutsi children left in their care. They were swept up by gangs, handed machetes, and ordered to kill or die. No place was safe for the Tutsi. Many of the Hutu and Tutsis were Catholic, but ethnic hatred was much more powerful than the religion they shared. A story of a priest ordering a church full of Tutsi refugees to be bulldozed with 1,500 refugees inside, and stories of covenant nuns ratting out refugees. In one covenant in Sovu, the nuns locked refugees in a garage and gave the military gasoline to burn it down. The Interahamwe, which was the most powerful Hutu paramilitary group, made special efforts to have, unconsensual relationships with the women. Sometimes, the victims were immediately killed after the relation. Sometimes, they were left to die of grotesque mutilations. And other times, they were caged for another round of, non-consensual relations. Finally, after 3 months of killing, Tutsi rebels under Paul Kagame broke through the front lines and raced to rescue their surviving Tutsi kinsmen. Hutu, by the millions, fled into neighboring countries to avoid justice. Shortly afterwards, the United Nations estimated that 800,000 Rwandans had been killed in just 3 months. And the Rwandan government eventually set the official death toll of the genocide at 937,000. It was the worst single episode of pure genocide in decades, and it was 5 times as swift as the Holocaust. After their decades of wars and conquests, the Romans acquired hundreds of thousands of prisoners and confiscated vast estates from enemies all over the world, all of which they auctioned off to Roman speculators. This was especially true in Sicily, where the Punic Wars had broken the old Carthaginian and Greek aristocracy, replacing it with huge plantations worked by slaves for the profit of Roman landlords. In 134 BC, the slaves of a wealthy Roman planter outside the Cilician town of Henna killed their master. The murder put not only the killers under the threat of crucifixion, but also, by Roman law, every slave in the household. Faced with this gruesome penalty for merely being in the wrong place at the wrong time, all of the slaves fled into the mountains. There, they attached themselves to another runaway slave, a former Syrian slave named Antiochus. He had taken over a mountain shrine to the earth goddess Demeter. By hiding a nut filled with sulfur and fire in his mouth, Antiochus breathed flames when he spoke, which amazed his followers and convinced them he spoke for the goddess. Here, he grew a community of runaway slaves that supported itself by robbing travelers and plantations. It swelled to 2,000 followers as more slaves flocked to the temple of Demeter. Their general, a Greek slave named Achaeus, traveled around the island recruiting soldiers for the cause, attracting a number of free farmers who disliked the plantation owners as much as any slave. This rebel army then beat the Roman governor of Sicily and his hastily assembled militia. That boosted Antiochus' following tenfold and more. He soon agreed to recognize Antiochus as the king of Sicily. By now, 70,000 slaves were under arms. Because the Romans were tied up with wars elsewhere, they couldn't give the rebellious slaves their undivided attention. But they still managed to throw an army or two together every year to deal with the slaves. Eventually, Publius Rupilius, the latest Roman consul in charge of crushing the rebellion, took it upon himself to crucify any slaves he captured alive, which he did to about 20,000 of them. Finally, both Roman consuls took their combined armies into the heart of rebel territory and besieged Henna for 2 days. When the rebels were finally starved out and crushed, Antiochus was taken back to Rome. However, he was not publicly strangled in the manner of an honorable foreign enemy. Instead, he died forgotten in a prison. While the big plantations prospered, small farmers all across Sicily were being forced into slavery by the crushing debt they owed the lenders and landowners. Because so many of these new slaves had been subjugated via shady deals, the Roman governor of Sicily, Publius Licinius Nerva, established a court to hear claims. He proved to be too efficient for his own good. After he freed around 800 wrongly enslaved people, the local planters bullied him into dropping the issue. The governor backed down and told any plaintiffs who still had cases pending that they would have to remain slaves. So the slaves decided to revolt. The rebel slave Salvius took control of the uprising under the new name Tryphon. By sheer numbers, the slaves quickly took over most of the large country estates. Most towns shut their gates in time and remained Roman. However, the rebels kept food from reaching the towns, and famine followed. The governor had only unskilled soldiers at his disposal, and these were beaten outside the town of Morgantia. The town itself was saved from capture only when the Romans offered freedom to any town slaves who helped defend the walls. Needing more men, the governor came to an agreement with one of the bandit gangs that ranged freely in the mountains. The bandits were given a pardon if they fought against the slaves, but this also failed to break the rebellion. By now, Sicily had 2 slave rebellions and 2 slave leaders, Salvius of the interior and Athenian in the west, and they agreed to rule jointly. Soon after, 14,000 Roman veterans arrived from the mainland. Although outnumbered, they beat the combined slave armies by superior discipline, but the Roman general did not press his advantage, and the slaves escaped into the mountains. The general was replaced for his failure, but the next year, his replacement was himself replaced, because he wasn't doing any better. Finally, a third general, the consul Manius Aquilius, wiped out the slave armies in 2 years of hard combat. Manius Aquilius also personally killed the enemy commander, Athenion, face to face in the middle of the battle. Spartacus was born in modern-day Bulgaria and served in the Roman army until he deserted and turned to banditry. After being caught, he was sold to the gladiatorial school in Capuia. There, he was put through the customarily brutal training until he and about 70 of his fellow gladiators escaped into the countryside. His band quickly grew to 1,000 escaped slaves and knocked back the first Roman legion sent to punish them. Then, they camped in the natural fortress formed by the dormant volcanic crater of Vesuvius. When a new Roman legion cornered Spartacus in this hideout, his army slid down a sheer cliff face on ropes made from vines. Then, Spartacus snuck around and destroyed them. Convinced now of the gravity of the uprising, the Roman Senate sent 4 legions to crush the rebels. Spartacus headed north, hoping to escape from Italy over the Alps, where his followers would split up and make their separate ways home. However, his army preferred to stay and loot Italy, so Spartacus turned south again and wreaked havoc on his way back down the peninsula. He beat every Roman contingent that went against him. With each victory, Spartacus gathered more weapons to arm his followers, who now numbered in the tens of thousands. Spartacus eventually arrived at the very tip of Italy, where he planned to cross over to Sicily and take the island from the Roman Empire. He had negotiated with pirates to ferry his army in exchange for allowing them to use the Sicilian ports. But at the last minute, the pirates backed out of the deal, stranding the gladiators on the mainland. Meanwhile, the Roman war effort came under the command of Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, who financed a new army. Crassus built a massive wall across the toe of Italy, which is 32,000 troops occupied, to hold the 100,000 rebels in the south and starve them through the winter. Spartacus crucified a random Roman prisoner in front of his army to remind his men of the horrible fate that awaited them if they lost. So they tried to break through the wall. But that failed, and they tried again, and around 1/3 of the rebels escaped with Spartacus. The rest of the force was left behind to be leisurely wiped out. His forces now seriously weakened, Spartacus was being harassed up and down southern Italy while his army whittled away. After the gladiators lost, 6,000 of them were crucified, and Spartacus was never heard from again.